It is rumored that a contestant became a black bear's lunch during filming, which kept the show's content shelved. Is this really true? Let's set out with 10 pieces of equipment. The challenge takes place on Vancouver Island in the Eastern Pacific. 10 survival experts from around the world will be dropped off at different locations on the island. With only 10 designated tools in hand, they will engage in a wilderness survival showdown. The last one standing will win a cash prize of $500,000. As the dinghy slowly departs, the 10 are dropped at their respective starting points. The first contestant, Josh, watches the crew leave. Too nervous to put his feelings into words, he just hopes to safely return home. After a quick inventory check, Josh plans to set up his shelter first. He ties a rope between 2 large trees and covers it with a tarp. This creates a simple, drafty wilderness shelter. Afterward, he finds a piece of pine wood with resin, a great fire starter. He plans to build a campfire before dark. Back in Jackson's hometown, what was once a happy family of 5 faces a new challenge as his wife is pregnant again. To earn money for his unborn son's milk, he signs up for the competition. The fire tinder simply won't catch, no doubt due to the damp environment. Josh decides to familiarize himself with the terrain and look for dry tinder. Shortly after, he finds a half-eaten salmon, a bad sign indicating the presence of many predators. Just then, he spots a cave on the mountain, clearly a black bear's den. Thinking of his nearby shelter, Josh becomes extremely uneasy. Just as he decides to return to camp, a noise from above startles him. The camera zooms in to see a black bear eyeing him. This frightens Josh immensely. Unexpectedly, another bear is spotted on a different tree. The start of the game is thrilling, and Josh runs back to camp without looking back. Joe, the season's second contestant, lands in a swampy area. His primary task is to quickly find dry ground to set up shelter. Back in Ontario, Joe is a dedicated father who joined the competition to provide for his daughter's education and improve his family's life. After searching in the woods for most of the day, he finds a small clearing. The bad news is that it's next to an animal trail frequently used by large animals. With no better options, Joe builds a simple A-frame shelter using ropes and a tarp, hoping it will keep him safe through the night. The chubby man chopping wood is named Chris. He just arrived here and set a survival goal of 90 days, nearly losing his life in the process. Back in Florida, Chris runs a farm, but has never encountered real predators in the wild. He joined this competition primarily to test his mental toughness. After great effort, he chopped down a log and urgently needed to start a fire, as neither jackals nor bears could harm him then. However, when he tried to light the fire, he discovered the tinder wouldn't catch. Without a fire, he was at risk of danger at any moment. The fourth contestant, Mickey, collected a handful of small sea snails on his first day here. Although not enough to fill him, they provided more protein than a pound of beef. With the tide still low, he hurried to find some relatively dry firewood. On the way back to camp, encountering this fellow in the wilderness could be dangerous, so Mickey quickly returned to camp with the firewood, shaved some dry wood shavings with a knife, and started a fire using dry grass. Back in Massachusetts, Mickey often went camping with his family. Each time he made a campfire in front of his daughter, he felt unprecedented pride. He joined the competition mainly to provide a better life for his daughter. After rubbing the flint several times, the tinder ignited effortlessly. He then enjoyed a meal of collected mussels, which were perfectly seasoned and provided substantial energy. However, just as he was full and ready to rest, he heard wolves howling outside the camp. Back to Josh, he nearly wet himself at noon when he encountered 2 black bears and has since been too scared to enter the forest again. After wandering by the lake for half an hour, he unsurprisingly found more bear tracks. As dusk fell, Josh hadn't even had any hot water to drink. To safely make it through the night, he bravely entered his shelter. The creature's large, bright eyes suggested it was large, scaring Josh immensely. He immediately grabbed an axe in self-defense. The black bear, realizing the threat, carefully scoped out the tent with its brother. The wild bears, unaccustomed to such a situation, turned and ran, terrified. It was a truly horrifying experience, ensuring a sleepless, fearful night for Josh. By the next morning, Josh immediately called the show's producers. His speed of quitting was unmatched. Facing questions from the search and rescue team, Josh felt no regret. After all, last night's experience was unforgettable for a lifetime. At this point, he didn't care about others' opinions. He blamed the bear dens all around his starting point, a challenge anyone would struggle with. As Josh was packing to leave, even the black bear came out to see him off, seemingly sad about his departure. That same night, Chris also couldn't sleep. The howling wolves outside heightened his anxiety. Already fearful of large predators, facing this situation on his first day was tough. Barely making it to the third day, Chris called the producers right after getting up. Facing skepticism from the rescue team, he shared his childhood trauma and fear of wolves and grizzly bears. He hadn't expected to quit so soon. After all, his family depended on him back home, and he didn't want to risk his life. He quickly packed his bags and took a boat home. Now, 8 contestants remained. Lucas, the man wearing a red cap, had sewn eyes on the back of his hat to prevent mountain lion attacks from behind, hoping to confuse them and delay his demise. From Iowa, Lucas was an outdoor survival instructor and studied survival skills with friends. His family had high hopes for him in this competition, aiming to win $500,000 to get married. Entering a small grove, he decided to build a luxurious shelter. He collected a lot of logs, secured them with ropes, built the basic frame, and covered it with a waterproof tarp to complete his makeshift wilderness villa. To avoid getting cold at night, he made a mattress from spruce branches. After setting everything up, he hoped to survive the night. Over to Sam, who was making a simple water storage container by chiseling a large hole in the middle of a log and covering it with a waterproof tarp, ready to collect rainwater. From Las Vegas, an error had made him a father at 22. To earn money for his unborn child's formula, he joined the competition at his wife's repeated suggestion. Sam planned to build his shelter by the lake, a location with a broad view to keep an eye on the surroundings. After building the basic frame, he covered it with the usual waterproof tarp, hoping the strong winds wouldn't blow it away. The 7th contestant to appear is named Vinny. He is trying to start a fire in this desolate place by scraping some dry tinder with a small knife, and he experiments with it using some collected dry grass. Despite rubbing the fire stick dozens of times, the tinder just won't ignite. In St. John's, Vinny has his own weapons collection room. He often enjoys crafting primitive stone tools and has made many beautifully shaped daggers. His craftsmanship far surpasses that of his neighbor, Desi. After 49 minutes of friction, the tinder finally emits blue smoke. With a fire source now available, Vinny immediately goes to the river to boil a pot of water. Whether or not it can replenish protein, he starts with a few sips of boiled water to warm his stomach. Arriving at Alan's place in search of a suitable campsite, he runs around the mountain several times. Not only is he completely soaked, but he also burns hundreds of calories unnecessarily. At a small stream, he fills a large pot with water. Without a fire source, he risks drinking the raw water to quench his thirst. Alan lives with his wife in the suburbs, leading an ordinary life together. Considering the $500,000 prize for winning the competition, he entered to buy a farm near his hometown. After wandering around a small forest, Alan finds an unusually large slug, a rare delicacy in the wild. Without a second thought, he cooks it in a pot. Just minutes later, he eagerly enjoys the taste, despite its bitterness, knowing it provides more protein than beef. On Mickey's end, it's already the 3rd day. He has been relying on collected rainwater for drinking. His campsite, surrounded by no sign of water, leaves him worried about dehydration. Thus, today's task is to explore the surroundings. After walking several hundred meters along the ridge, the dry ground resembles a desert, and he can't find water anywhere. Just as Mickey is about to give up in the afternoon, he suddenly hears the sound of water from across the lake. Drawing on years of wilderness experience, he concludes there must be fresh water there, but getting across becomes a major problem. He sits and thinks for half an hour, collects a bunch of tender branches, and wraps them tightly in a waterproof cloth, creating a makeshift floating device. Stripping down, he pulls the small boat into the water. Fortunately, the buoyancy is effective, eliminating the risk of falling into the water. Carefully, he finally reaches the opposite shore of the lake, and as expected, there is a wild stream with fresh water. Mickey decides to move his campsite there. It takes about 2.5 hours to move everything before dark. While there's still a little light, he hurries to set up shelter. He constructs a simple triangular frame and covers it with waterproof cloth to prevent getting wet from heavy rain. After a busy day, Mickey boils himself some water, and the day's fatigue seems to vanish. Now, he can finally rest. The camera shifts to Joe. Due to continuous rain in recent days, the moist environment has prevented him from starting a fire. He went to the riverbank hoping to find some protein, but was almost scared out of his wits when he turned around and saw a huge bear, weighing hundreds of pounds, foraging on the opposite bank. It hadn't noticed him yet. Surprisingly, Joe greeted the bear, which quickly became alert. Unthreatened, the bear continued towards Joe's camp. Frightened, Joe rushed back to his camp, not wanting a midnight visit from the bear. Considering this, Joe packed up and walked along the river for half an hour. He found a flat area by the sea, rich with seafood, solving his protein concerns. Exhausted from the day, he planned to treat himself well. By the fourth day, Joe woke up to find his flint missing, likely lost while making fire the day before. After searching for 2.5 hours, he still couldn't find it. Despite the previous day's campfire still burning, Joe impulsively called the show's crew. As the helicopter arrived, the rescue team was incredulous. On camera, Joe disregarded others' opinions. Perhaps unprepared, a small mistake led him to quit. He packed his belongings and contentedly boarded the helicopter home. Over to Vinny, he found a seabird lying breathless by the lake early in the morning. While others might have considered it food, eating an animal with an unknown cause of death was risky. Not feeling hungry, Vinny thought it too risky and threw it back into the lake. By the fourth day, he still hadn't found a suitable place to build a shelter. The area where he stayed the previous days was now uninhabitable due to high tide, forcing Vinny to search for a new living place. After circling the mountain, he finally found a good spot. However, the animal trails suggested it was frequented by black bears. Most people would have left, but Vinny thought differently. He believed that building a shelter there would make the bear give up its territory. But was this really the case? While the other contestants were preparing to rest, Vinny was alone, scouting the camp. Suddenly, he came face to face with a black bear, which terrified him. He ran back to camp without looking back, thinking he'd be safe once inside his shelter. However, it wasn't long before sounds of branches breaking surrounded him, and a pair of shiny eyes appeared outside the camp. Vinny immediately called the show's crew. Since helicopters and boats couldn't reach at night, the rescue team had to drive through the night, ensuring Vinny's safety via walkie-talkie while speeding towards the forest. Meanwhile, the bear had found Vinny's shelter and was cautiously exploring this foreign intruder. Terrified, Vinny was cowering and trembling inside the shelter. As the rescue team approached on foot, armed with bear spray, they lost contact with Vinny for over an hour, fearing the worst. But as they reached the shore, they saw a bright flare in the distance, Vinny's signal. It was a close call, and both parties felt much relieved. Winning the competition no longer mattered. Vinny just wanted to go home and leave this dreadful place. Finally, under the guidance of the rescue team, he successfully withdrew from the challenge, leaving 6 contestants. The 9th contestant, Brent, has been disheveled since arriving in this desolate wilderness. Considering the time and effort needed to make fire and boil water, he has been using sphagnum moss to filter raw water, believing it effectively removed impurities. After gulping down a large mouthful, he felt immediately energized. Brent, a veteran, had undergone professional military training over decades. He joined this competition to prove himself in this environment. The last contestant to appear is named Das. He found a fresh seaweed on the beach, shaved it with a knife, and threw it directly into his mouth. The taste was neither salty nor bland, but crunchy. The calories were at least 10 times that of beef. Back in Pennsylvania, Das and his wife lived a happy life. Since they had no children yet, they decided to travel abroad immediately. Thus, Das wanted to sign up and give it a try. Seeing a cypress washed ashore, Das decided to move it back to camp first. It might come in handy. However, he underestimated the log's weight. Already lacking extra strength, he decided to leave it and reconsider later. Over at Alan's side, he hadn't replenished his protein for several days. His stomach was already starving. After a quick inspection around the lake, he found lots of wild seaweed. Perhaps out of sheer hunger, he picked it up and ate it without hesitation. How was the taste? Although low in calories, it was better than an empty stomach. Alan marked the days on a stick with his knife, each notch representing a day. He hoped to last 80 days and would be satisfied. Coming to Lucas, he had been chopping trees these days, wanting to build a wilderness mansion here. For him, as long as he lived well and enjoyed himself, the result of the competition didn't matter. But looking at his small frame, even chopping a log was a great effort. He feared he wouldn't survive the mansion law. After chopping more than a dozen trees, he was too tired. He could only sit down and rest for a while, recalling the clay he found by the river. He planned to use it to make a fireplace, which would provide good insulation even if the temperature dropped. But today's tasks ended here, and other matters would wait until tomorrow. Over at Mickey's, to get better shots, he had to carry 40 pounds of filming equipment back and forth by the river every day. The huge energy expenditure made him feel hungry from time to time. Seeing the eagles perched on the branches, Mickey concluded they often fished in this area. The remains of fish by the river also proved this. Without a doubt, the river in front of him definitely had delicious fish. So, he immediately took out his net and began setting it up around him, hoping to enjoy a feast by tomorrow night. Lucas also found something good on the other side. Out exploring with his gear, he stumbled upon a bunch of chicken of the woods mushrooms. This delicacy was a rare find in the wilderness. His meals for the next few days were temporarily secured. While others sought protein sources, Alan chewed seaweed right at his doorstep. As long as he wasn't hungry, that was enough for him. Mickey, anticipating extinguished fires at night, boiled a pot of water. Using a small knife, he shaved birch bark into fibers, placed them in an iron box with fish hooks, and roasted it in the fire. Once the organic fibers carbonized, he had a box of dry tinder. To test its effectiveness, Mickey quickly struck his flint, and the tinder easily ignited. This relieved his future fire-starting worries. Brant, possibly from drinking unboiled water in the morning, couldn't sleep at all at night due to continuous stomach cramps. The discomfort made it impossible to lie down, and he endured until daylight. Still feeling unwell, he dragged himself upstream to check the water, nearly vomiting at the sight of rotten fish surrounding the water. Realizing he had drunk such water days before, Brant felt like dying. Back at camp, calming himself, he suspected he had ingested parasites. Despite the playful nature of the competition, risking his life wasn't worth it. Without hesitation, he called the production team. Upon their arrival, they confirmed his request to quit the competition. He insisted he was ill, packed up, and quickly left the contest. Hungry Mickey decided to check the net he set up. Expecting a catch, he found seaweed tangled in the net, but moving forward, discovered a large white salmon weighing over 10 pounds. Lucky to have a feast that night, and to prevent a cougar attack, he swiftly returned to camp. He started a large fire, processed the fish, and wrapped the fatty meat in wood sticks and bark. He cooked it until golden and crispy. The fish, tender, sweet, and crunchy, was full of protein, far exceeding that of beef. However, as he enjoyed the meal, noise from the camp's outskirts startled him. Spotting an adult cougar just 3 meters from camp, it vanished into the jungle at the sound. Alarmed, Mickey quickly grabbed his dagger and bear spray, hoping to safely make it through the night. It was the morning of day 7. Thankfully, the cougar from last night did not follow. Otherwise, the outcome could have been bad. Realizing his shelter was too flimsy, Mickey planned to reinforce it today. Daz hadn't eaten anything nutritious here. He spent his days sitting by the shore, feeling the cold wind, and watching otters eat in the middle of the lake. Sadly, they were too far from the shore to reach. He continued to collect trash along the shore, taking everything usable and unusable back to camp. Along the way, he found some good items, like a pallet perfect for a bed base, which he decided to take immediately. Lucas, as usual, he spotted a small island across the lake and came up with a bold idea to build a sturdy boat. This would give him an additional way to hunt. As the storm grew fiercer, the terrible weather made hunting impossible. Most contestants hid in their shelters to rest. The continuous hurricane and heavy rain soaked half of Sam's shelter. He just hoped to get through the night. Das sat shivering in his shelter, experiencing such torment for the first time in his life. Surrounded only by cameras, the feeling of loneliness in the wilderness began to overwhelm him. By midnight, this feeling intensified. Das just wanted to return to the warmth and comfort of his bedroom. He managed to endure until the morning of the 8th day, when he saw a small yacht from the production team on the lake. Das finally called the production team. Rather than continue suffering here, he preferred to pack up and go home. By day 8, only 4 contestants remained. To replenish protein, Sam went to the shore early in the morning to catch crabs. He had seen many small crabs in this area in the previous days. which were crucial for his daily energy. After half an hour of hard work, he gathered 33 small crabs. With a daily need of 3, he wouldn't worry about food for the next 10 days. Eagerly, he quickly set up to cook them over the fire. Lucas has arrived. Starting today, he is officially building his small boat. The plan alone will take over 10 days. He first chops a small piece of wood for the bow, then selects straight logs for the keel. By securely tying these together, he has a fine bow. Despite the recent light rain, he fixes 2 flexible branches on top to form the hull. If tired, the tribe drinks plain hot water to warm their stomachs. After more than a week of hard work, the basic structure of the hull is finally completed. By the 15th day, Lucas is ready to test the boat on water. He wraps the hull in a sturdy waterproof fabric and quickly launches the boat. Surprisingly, its buoyancy is excellent. Though it tends to veer off course, there are no other issues. It seems time to take full control of the race. Alan is focusing on protein intake. Days ago, he set a spike net by the river, anticipating an abundance of fish. Planning for excess, he decides to build a separate kitchen outside the camp. After setting up the basic structure and neatly covering it with spruce branches to keep it dry, he works through heavy rain for over 3 hours, completing a simple wilderness kitchen. He then checks the spike net trap by the river, but finds it empty after the tide recedes. Alan concludes it's a matter of insufficient waiting time and hopes for a bigger catch in a few days. After mentally boosting himself, Alan gathers as many mussels as possible from the shore, filling a large pot to roast over the fire. Within minutes, he eagerly enjoys the tasty mussels, perfectly seasoned and richer in protein than beef. Mickey has had a rough week with continuous rainy weather causing all his clothes to mold. With today's slight weather improvement, he must air out all his garments. Mold on the skin can cause anything from swelling and allergies to severe skin ulcers. If he misses out on the prize money due to illness, it would not be worth it. As night falls, Mickey hesitates to sleep, having found mold on his quiver. Living in such conditions could lead to rheumatism. If the weather doesn't improve, the outcome is uncertain. Sam has been feasting on shoreline crabs these past days. With protein sources running low, he plans to collect giant kelp nearby. He brings it back to camp, slicing it into thin strips to heat on a stone slab. Tasting it, he finds it chewy like rubber bands, far from the delicious expectations set by recent crab meals. Reflecting on better days, the stark contrast brings tears to the eyes of this 22-year-old. Lucas has been confident in his boat since its successful maiden voyage. Today, he decides to try his luck across the river. After packing his gear and donning a life jacket, he quickly sets off. In just over 10 minutes, Lucas reaches a marshy area. Observing the bubbles emerging from the ground, he concludes there must be delicious protein beneath the water. He carefully drags his boat to shore, but as he prepares to dig, the seawater unexpectedly starts to rise rapidly, catching him off guard. Lucas immediately rushes back to shore with his boat. Not wanting to return empty-handed, he finds a new spot with abundant clam resources and successfully collects a full bag. He plans to return to this area often. Meanwhile, Alan checks the spike net he set up a few days ago and is surprised to find it caught a large crab and several unidentified small fish. Perhaps due to hunger, Alan tears down the net to unload his catch, wondering how to use it next time in its damaged state. He carefully places the crab in a pot, adding kelp and mussels for a nutritious soup. Alan carves a wooden spoon for himself and eagerly enjoys the seafood feast as it's ready. After several days of hunger, he catches a large and fatty mahi-mahi, which tries to resist at the end, quickly dispatches it with an axe, guts it by the river, and secures his meals for the coming week. Over at Mickey's side, there's a large piece of leftover fish from a few days ago. He cooks it with mussels in a pot, creating a nutritious seafood soup that is deeply satisfying and provides energy many times that of beef. On day 17, 4 contestants remain. Last night, Lucas woke up numerous times, completely drained by diarrhea. He still feels turmoil in his stomach this morning, taking the rainy day as a chance to rest properly. Taking advantage of the slight improvement in weather, Mickey hurried to the riverbank to check his spike net, hoping to catch a big meal over the past few days. Instead, he spotted a rainbow in the sky, which for him was more than just a pretty sight. It was a beacon of hope after the rain, signaling good hunting days ahead. His sleeping bag had already started to mildew, so he quickly took it out to dry in the sun on the shore. Nearby, Lucas stripped off his clothes and basked in the sunlight. Despite visibly losing weight, his determination remained unshaken. Over at Alan's spot, to rid himself of dirt, he stripped and jumped into the river, enjoying the clear weather to the fullest. On day 23, Sam woke up feeling exhausted. Mice in the camp had kept him awake all night. With no other food available, he decided to try catching some. Using sharpened sticks and fishing line, he set about making several sensitive trip devices. Gathering all the necessary parts, he started setting them up outside, a task requiring great patience and careful attention to avoid injuries. After 2.5 hours, he successfully set up several mouse traps just before dark, his hands bloodied but hopeful for a potential feast the next day. Lucas, meanwhile, had found some floats by the shore a few days earlier, a treasure for him. Considering the schools of wild fish in the area, he planned to use the floats to make a traditional trolling line. The idea was to use the floats to keep the lines with hooks afloat, allowing him to fish with 6 hooks simultaneously and increase his chances of a catch. He cut the floats into thick slices with his bush knife and threaded hemp rope through them. After tying the hooks, he immediately went into the water to set it up, now just waiting for the fish to come to him. Back to Alan, who, full of anticipation, went to the shore to check his spike net, only to find it had several large holes and no fish in sight. On his way back to camp, he found several plastic bottles by the shore. Planning to make simple fish traps, he cut the bottles in half and inserted the top inverted into the bottom to form a funnel-shaped trap. This simple device typically has a success rate over 80%, making it hard for trout to escape once inside. He set up a few of these small traps by a pond, though not expecting to catch anything large. Whether he catches any fish now depends on luck. At Mickey's place, after several days without protein, he arrived early at the lake to check his spike net trap. Before he even got close, he noticed some seaweed hanging on the net, suggesting there might be something underneath. However, when he pulled it up, he found an ugly, decomposed national treasure fish, dead for at least 2.5 days. He initially wanted to check if there was any edible fish meat left, but a sudden foul smell made Mickey instantly abandon the idea. It was a pity to watch the protein become inedible, more painful than being hurt, but he blamed himself for finding it too late. It looked like he would have to go to bed hungry at camp tonight. On day 25, Sam excitedly started checking his mouse traps, but found nothing. As expected, the last few traps were also empty. With no other food available, he had to reset the traps. Possibly due to his agitation, he hurt his hand several times with slabs of stone. After half an hour of work, he hadn't set up a single trap. Already frustrated by the lack of food, the light rain that began to fall made Sam lose all hope. He decided to just go back to camp and lie down. At Lucas's spot, today was the day to check the fishing gear. He quickly wrapped the boat in waterproof cloth and set off with his paddle. As he pulled up the trap, the increasing weight indicated something was caught. Indeed, he pulled up a wild carp weighing just under 10 kilograms. Thrilled, it seemed he wouldn't have to starve anymore. He returned to shore, set up a pot right there, and began cooking. Over at Alan's, after waiting 2.5 days and taking advantage of the low tide, he hurried to check his fishing trap. Surprisingly, it had caught some fish, enough small catfish to last him a few more days. Back to Mickey, possibly due to the high tide, the spike net he had set up a few days ago was now gone, clearly washed away by the current. His only reliable fishing tool was lost. After searching the shore for half an hour, he found nothing. Whether he can keep going is now uncertain. At Alan's spot, he officially began constructing his oversized fish trap today. He collected a bunch of soft but sturdy branches and bent them into the basic shape of a fish basket. Next, he used another branch to determine the overall size and length. He continued weaving along the basic shape until he had a solid frame. He then wrapped smaller branches around the gaps. Alan repeated this work every day, except for occasional breaks to eat, sleep, and use the bathroom. After a week, by day 30, Alan's large fish trap was finally complete. Once a trout entered, it would not be able to escape. He then took the trap to the lake, positioning it where wild fish often appeared, hoping his efforts would pay off. By day 31, Alan eagerly checked the trap first thing in the morning, but surprisingly, it was empty. After all his hard work, he couldn't end up empty-handed. Alan felt he hadn't waited long enough and the bait inside needed more time to decompose and attract fish. He speculated that in a few more days he might have a big catch. Over at Sam's, the temperature had dropped to -5 degrees Celsius, and the surrounding grass was covered in frost. Prepared for the possibility of not finding food, Sam began checking his mouse traps. Perhaps because he had become very thin, he finally caught a mouse. The unexpected catch was almost unbelievable to Sam. He immediately returned to camp to start processing it. By day 32, 4 contestants were still in the game. As the weather grew colder, Lucas's small shelter was no longer sufficient. Considering he often went fishing, he decided to build his shelter right by the lake, choosing a relatively good spot. This place became his new home. After 2.5 hours of busy work, he moved all his belongings there. To avoid branches overhead, he climbed up a tree and sawed them off, which significantly enlarged the space. Next, he prepared to set up a yurt. Possibly due to malnutrition, simple tasks became extremely difficult for Lucas. Each swing of the axe made him see stars, but he had to endure to survive in the wilderness. As it began to lightly snow, it meant that available protein was scarce. The first thing he did upon waking was to check the mouse traps he had set the day before. As expected, the first trap was not triggered. Excitedly checking the second, it too was empty. Just when he thought he'd go hungry again, the third trap successfully caught something. Overjoyed by this sudden gain, Sam hurried back to camp to start roasting over a large fire, thoroughly enjoying the meal. By day 33, the continuous low temperatures had numbed him to the point of unconsciousness. When he went out in the morning to check the spike net, he was completely numb from the cold. Ice had even formed inside the camp. Hunting in such weather was impossible. He quickly gathered more firewood and thawed his numb feet by the fire. As for protein, he decided to wait until tomorrow. On day 34, Lucas woke up feeling terrible. He almost froze sleeping outside the night before. He was determined to build his house today. He used a rope to encircle a waterproof cloth around some wooden stakes. He hammered a few crescent-shaped stakes into the ground and laid stone slabs on top. Then he gathered a large pile of sticks and arranged them into a conical shape on the roof, forming the basic structure of a yurt. Finally, he covered everything with the waterproof cloth, ensuring a small hole was left in the middle to let smoke escape. After over 3 hours of work, the warm and comfortable yurt was finally complete. Now, he no longer had to worry about freezing at night. Exhausted from hunger after a day and night, braving the bitter cold, he went to the lakeside to check the spike net. Surprisingly, he caught a bighead carp. He slid it open, removed the innards, and found more good stuff in the net, a rare wilderness delicacy. While processing the food on the ground, the previously clear weather suddenly turned to light snow. Luckily, today's meal was already arranged. Rainbow trout paired with prime duck meat, garnished with kelp strips. Meanwhile, Mickey was also searching for protein. Having carelessly lost his spike net earlier, he had to make a traditional trolling device with fishing line, using an endless supply of mussel meat from the shore as bait. He hoped to catch a big meal at high tide. While light snow fell at other camps, it poured rain at his location. Fearing the spike net might be swept away by the water, he checked it in the rain. Sure enough, the net had blown away. The consequences of losing it were unthinkable. As he went to retrieve it, he suddenly found a bird tangled in the net, stealing his fish. In such a situation, anyone would be upset. Holding the heavy bird, at least 10 pounds, he plucked its feathers and cleaned out its organs by the water. He didn't eat the tasty wings and neck, throwing them into the water to feed the fish. After processing, only a few breast meats remained. What could have lasted a week would now only last a day. He immediately started cooking a big fire back at the camp, enjoying a feast inside the yurt. A simple trip to collect firewood suddenly reminded him of his wife back home, who was pregnant. Leaving her alone at home made him feel a sudden and overwhelming guilt. Living here for so many days, he couldn't imagine anything more painful. He was ready to run away, but for the $500,000, Sam decided to stick it out for a few more days to see how things went. On day 35, Mickey excitedly went to check his fishing line at the lake. However, as he approached the shore, he was stunned. The tide had not receded, making it impossible to retrieve his carefully laid trolling line. It was risky to enter the water prematurely as hypothermia could ensue. He sat on the shore, pondering for half an hour. Memories of his family surged, pushing him to endure the hardships for the $500,000 prize. Alan, too, felt homesick. Every time he lay down at the campsite, images of his wife and son appeared vividly. Only those who have experienced it know this feeling. To pass the lonely time, he decided to make a guitar for singing. He planed a log flat, burned a large hole in the middle with charcoal, and covered it with a lid. Fishing line replaced the guitar strings, completing his mini guitar. By day 37, 4 contestants remained. Alan woke up dizzy, weak, and unable to eat a proper meal, driving him nearly insane. With no strength, even slight movement left him breathless. Hunting was out of the question. To stave off hunger, he resorted to eating spruce bark. Over at Lucas's side, the loneliness intensified with time. Thanks to the guitar he crafted, he could distract himself during lonely moments. The initial excitement had faded for Lucas, and even he was unsure if he could continue. Sam planned to take his bow and arrows up the mountain today. After walking several hundred meters along the ridge, he shot at a darting squirrel but missed due to poor archery skills, catching no protein. Returning to camp, he found a mouse in a trap but felt no interest. He awoke hungry before dawn. Unable to endure any longer, he decided to check the spike net, but the tide had not yet receded, and retrieving the net meant waiting 2 more days. Unable to wait, Alan turned his attention to the kelp on the shore. Despite being moldy, a simple rinse in water made it edible and a significant energy source. Not satisfied with just kelp, Alan also found some seaweed by the lake and started eating it directly. Arriving at Lucas's place, he hadn't had any proper food for days since his last wilderness feast. More than the pain of hunger, he longed to go home and reunite with his wife. After contemplating for 2.5 hours in the shelter, Lucas finally called the show's crew, packed his bags, and regretfully withdrew from the competition on day 39, leaving 3 contestants remaining. While out walking, Mickey found a dead otter that didn't seem fully decomposed. He brought it back to camp to dissect it. After 2.5 hours of work, he successfully obtained a complete fur, which he dried on a wooden frame to make a nice pillowcase. On day 42, Alan eagerly went to check his fishing nets and was lucky to catch 2 large catfish. Along with freshly picked seaweed, he enjoyed a feast that day. However, upon returning to camp, he found the campfire nearly out. Alan quickly revived it by blowing air and adding wood chunks. He roasted the gourmet ingredients directly over the fire without any seasonings. Within minutes, Alan was enjoying the tender and flavorful fish by the lake. Thinking of the upcoming Thanksgiving and his mother's illness, Mickey worried about her worsening condition. After half an hour of contemplation at the camp, he called the show's crew. With the arrival of a small boat, Mickey quickly packed his bags and exited the competition to see his mother one last time, preferring that over winning $500,000. Mickey's exit left only 2 contestants remaining. On day 45, Vancouver Island faced another hurricane. Watching his shaky shelter, Sam worried but prioritized his safety and took refuge in his camp, expecting the storm to last about 10 days. If his shelter were destroyed, he decided he would immediately quit the competition, tired of the harsh conditions. Now, he could only leave it to fate. Meanwhile, Alan, despite the weather's challenges, felt an overwhelming hunger and survived by merely exhausting his body. Remembering his initial excitement upon arriving, Alan realized his mindset was changing. To persevere, he constantly told himself to live like a wild man, free from emotions and desires, to survive as long as possible. By day 54, Sam couldn't take it anymore. The severe hurricane weather was intensifying and slowly eroding his will. He remembered the feasts he had when he first arrived, but now he could only lie in the camp, starving. At this point, winning the competition no longer mattered. By day 55, speedboats appeared on the lake, likely to pick up Sam. As a 22-year-old, surviving over 50 days in the wild was impressive. Thinking of his pregnant wife at home, he was eager to return and make amends. Eventually, Sam packed his bags and regretfully withdrew from the competition. By day 56, while out for a walk, he found several slugs, a great source of energy in the wild. Without hesitation, he returned to camp and cooked them over a big fire. The production team also sent Alan a medical examination notification. With the arrival of the medical team, Alan cooperated fully with all the examinations. When asked about his experience, he felt confident to continue as long as the other contestants were still competing. It was only when the director told him he didn't need to persist that Alan, in disbelief, repeatedly confirmed the news. Then his wife joyfully approached, and the couple embraced excitedly. The separation they endured was something the single viewers couldn't understand. Alan then showed his wife around his dwelling. She pulled out a $500,000 check from her pocket. Alan had already planned how to spend this life-changing prize. First, he would have his elderly father retire, then pay for treatments for his mother and son, and use the rest to pay off the mortgage. Finally, after packing all his belongings, Alan reluctantly said goodbye to his jungle cabin and boarded the helicopter home with his wife.